My name is Thaddeus Metz, and I'm Distinguished Professor of Pan-African Thought and Research Professor of Philosophy here at UJ. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this critical engagement with a new book by Stu Woolman called The Selfless Constitution. The proceedings will be with me starting off for 10 minutes, giving you an overview of key philosophical themes from the book. And then I will hand things over to Professor Bonnie Meyersfeld for 15 or 20 minutes. She is Professor of Law at WITS and Director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies, CALS, which is also at WITS. And she's also one of the country's foremost leaders and practitioners when it comes to the relationship between gender and law. After she speaks, Sanele Sibanda, who's a senior lecturer at the WITS Law School, will also speak for 15 or 20 minutes. And he's, again, one of the country's leading thinkers about post-colonialism as it bears on the law in Southern Africa. Finally, our author, Stu Woolman, will respond for 15 or 20 minutes. Stu, besides being the author of The Selfless Constitution, is the Elizabeth Bradley Chair of Ethics, Governance, and Sustainable Development at WITS. He's the author of well over 100 articles and book chapters, and the editor of some important works in South African law, including CLOSA, Constitutional Law of South Africa, and an influential journal, Constitutional Court Review. After Stu speaks, we will then have at least a good half hour, I think, for questions from the audience. And after that, I'm told that the wine goes away. So if you want wine, you should get it now. And I'm told that you can't get wine after things are over because they're worried about students getting drunk. However, I wasn't told anything about professors getting a little tipsy. And so if you want to stay afterwards, I brought my single malt, and I'm happy to share with you.
I thought that was a gift for me, but I'm happy to share it with you too.
Okay. So 10 minutes from me about the Selfless Constitution. It's a big book. It's thick on the one hand. It's physically big, and it's long at about 650 pages. That's big for a book, but you can skip around and you can skip the endnotes. And it's well worth the read because the ideas are big, and that's what I'm going to focus on. The overarching question that Stu Woolman poses in the book is roughly, what is a constitution for? What is the point of having a constitution? Right? How should we interpret it? How should we implement it? Right? He wants to give us a comprehensive theory, not just of what a constitution in general is for, but what the South African Constitution in particular is for. The way I read the book is giving us a plausible philosophical or theoretical alternative to the dominant paradigm, which answers questions like these, which is roughly a Kantian liberal paradigm, going back to the very dead German philosopher Immanuel Kant. According to Kant and Kantians, ethics and law and justice is all ultimately a matter of respect for persons, where a person is an intelligent or rational or autonomous being. Right? People like you and me, we have a dignity relative to cats and plants and other things in the world because we can govern ourselves by our rational decision-making. According to this perspective, justice, or what a constitution ought to do, is to protect human rights, where human rights are ways of protecting people's freedom, their ability to make decisions for themselves. That's the dominant view insofar as the South African Constitutional Court has one. It's also been the dominant view among Western philosophers in the post-war era. And this kind of perspective influences international declarations and policies. On the face of it, the view is attractive. Right? It's pro-liberty, right? If what's special about us is our ability to make decisions for ourselves, then we should be left alone to decide whom to marry and where to live. If what's special about us is our capacity for self-governance, then democracy seems to follow as something morally required. And furthermore, if the poor are unfree because they lack resources, we get a quick justification for pro-poor distributive justice as well. What could be missing? Well, according to Stu and others in the past 20 or 30 years, what's missing is the idea that under a Kantian liberal framework, people could still live very bad lives and have very poor relationships with one another. Stu's work I see as part of a trend of a communitarian, or what philosophers sometimes call a perfectionist conception of the state or a constitutional order, with the idea that the job of the state isn't to protect freedom so much as to enable people to live good, meaningful, flourishing lives. Stu's theory is original. He's not merely borrowing from Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, who in the English world are well known for championing this kind of communitarian or perfectionist view. And he also doesn't borrow exclusively from Ubuntu, which I identify in this part of the world as also a rival to a Kantian liberal philosophical framework. Instead, Stu develops his own theories of the nature of a self, the nature of a society, what good versions of these would be, and how they ought to influence the way the Constitution is interpreted and applied. I want to break Stu's philosophy down into 3 parts, which I hope will make it a bit more concrete. I suspect our lawyers are going to make it even more applied and relevant in talking about some concrete issues. Philosophers ain't so good at that. One thing we can see Stu's theory of constitutionalism answering is the question of what's ultimately valuable from a political perspective. What should be the ultimate goal of a constitutional state? As I've said, from a Kantian perspective, the ultimate aim is to protect people's freedom, their abilities to live as they see fit. Stu's alternative is different. According to him, the fundamental aim of a constitution should be to protect the ability of everyone, including minorities, to live meaningful, flourishing lives. It's a very different kind of perspective. So whereas a Kantian would say the point of having a right to associate with people whom you'd like to live with or associate with, that's a matter of protecting your freedom. But from Stu's perspective, it's better seen as a way to enable you to flourish, to live an objectively good life. It's the second question that Stu's philosophy of law answers, and that's how to know or discover what's in fact meaningful or good. Right? Kantians typically do it by reasoning by themselves in an armchair. So for those of you who know the field, Jürgen Habermas and Alan Gewirth are most influential Kantians, and they think there's something implicit in the way we speak to each other or in the way we make decisions that commits us to a wide range of thick views about morality and the good life. Other Kantians like John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin, and a former self that's currently speaking, draw on intuitions. We sit and reflect about what seems relatively uncontroversial to us, and we try to generate theories on the basis of those things. Stu's alternative is different. According to him, we ought to instead experiment. The best way to discover what's actually good as opposed to bad is roughly to let people do their own thing and then to talk about the results, to enable people to live a wide array of lives and then for a wide number of voices to reflect on the findings, which is a very different sort of methodology. A third question that Stu's theory answers is the question of how to bring the good about. How do we get people to live good lives? From a Kantian perspective, that's simply not the job of the government at all. The government should leave you alone to make your own decisions about how to live. Stu's view is different. Instead, the state shouldn't be neutral. It should decide or have some views of better and worse ways to live. And then it should educate people about the good lives and discourage them from seeking the bad lives. And perhaps even what he calls nudge people into making better choices than they would make on their own. So I've given you three ways in which a Kantian would give us an account of what a constitution is for, and three ways in which Stu presents an alternative. That's all quite abstract, but in the book he does the admirable job of not merely giving us a rich, novel philosophy of what a constitution is for, but also applying it rigorously to a South African context. Indeed, he uses the theory to critically consider more than 20 different important court cases that have been tried in a South African context. I think it's really quite an accomplishment both to have developed the theory and to have applied it to South Africa. And in my view, the South African legal community really owes him a debt of gratitude. And after having read the book, I find it hard. I see the South African legal context in a brand new way, and one I'm not likely to forget soon. That is to give an overview of the book, and I now want to turn over to Bonnie Myersfeld for 15 or 20 minutes.
I had a professor many years ago when I was, really? Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody. And I had a professor, oh, no, thank you, that's very sweet. He used to talk about the fact that if you could explain a concept to a 4 or a 5-year-old and break it down into its simplest terms, that meant you really understood it. And if Thad could take that robust and very rich composium of ideas and embed it into a 10-minute, very accessible talk, that's almost, not quite, but almost as impressive as the writing itself. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the opportunity to engage in the book. When Thad did ask that I come and participate in this kind of gathering, I initially said, "Are you nuts?" Not at all. I'm by no means sufficiently engaged with Stu's work to be able to do so. And he suggested that I could have a go at certain aspects of the book, which I tried to do. But the problem is when you pick up this book, which aspects to choose, right? So you can go anywhere from Lake Titicaca, to, which I've been to, which is fantastic, to the ancient Greek evolution of the demos, to a squatter camp in South Africa and everywhere in between. And in beginning to read through Stu's book, I was reminded constantly, like a film through my head, of a film that I very much hope you have all seen, and that film is The Matrix. You've seen The Matrix. Please tell me you've seen The Matrix. Okay, great. And I'm delighted to be able to quote something that I think speaks to one of the most important philosophies in the world as enunciated by the Matrix, which is the following quote by Morpheus. Morpheus, you all know who Morpheus is, right? Okay, great. So Morpheus says, "This is your last chance." Come on, everyone knows the scene. "After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and you believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes." And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a rabbit hole. Now, Neo clearly is played by Stu, which I am, yes. Yeah, well, exactly, because he's got the glasses, right? So Stu is obviously Neo, challenging or being brought to a realization that things may not be quite as they seem. I'm still trying to determine if in Stu's book, the Constitutional Court is either Morpheus or the machines who construct the illusion of reality in which we all live. The cool woman, Trinity, we'll come back to that name in a second, is, as is most of the time the case in Hollywood, is indeed the sidekick true cool woman. And unfortunately, not much more other than an inversion of Sleeping Beauty where she kisses Neo into a reality. But the real comparator is between the Matrix. The Matrix is a perceived world of delusion. It is designated and constructed to subdue rather than stimulate. And it is this structure that is designed to subdue rather than stimulate that really resonated for me with one specific principle that emanates repeatedly from Stu's book, and that is the principle of the protection of freedom, as so eloquently elaborated by Thad, versus the principle of flourishing. And the Constitution, the Constitutional Court, and our political structures have indeed set out to achieve the protection of freedom, which to varying degrees we have secured, according to a classic interpretation, of the individual liberty. But what about this notion of flourishing? Does our Constitution, Stu asks, does our constitutional court and our political structures respond to the realities of this country in a manner that facilitates the true flourishing and stimulation of the individual and the group? And how do we as individuals see ourselves as part of that, political structure? Are we exercising political agency? Are we able to really participate in this political structure, not only because of our classic notions of economic and social and educational principles that determine whether or not one may participate, but also, I think, quite cleverly because of our own psychological assumption of an automatic life. And that's the principle I'd like to examine and explore. And I'd like to do so by beginning with Stu's assessment of, unsurprisingly, the Jordan case, right? And the Jordan case famously heard the issue of whether sex work should be decriminalized. Currently, as we all know, the work that constitutes sex work, historically known as prostitution, is in fact work that is criminal in this country. And one of the key arguments before the court in favor of decriminalization was that the implementation, the reality of criminalization, was that women and or other members of the profession, usually young boys, were not the ones, were always the ones who tended to be the respondents of this criminal injunction, as opposed to the quote-unquote Johns, right? So clients were not being criminalized, but indeed the service providers were. And this case really, I think, demonstrates, and Stu's discussion of the case demonstrates, that the Constitutional Court in its analysis failed to respond to the reality of the harm. What is the reality of harm? And here I might go beyond a little bit of what Stu's concern is with the reality of the harm. Stu posits the harm as the choice of between a severe form of indigence. I think you speak to starvation on the one hand, and the other hand, any way of getting out of indigence, namely sex work, if that's the option that's available to you. And that's not the four corners of Stu's argument, but it's on that point that I'd like to suggest that that's not quite the harm. Because the harm is not simply about being free to eat or not free to eat. I would argue that the harm is really about being free to flourish. So sex work is not in fact limited to the array of women and men who are so extremely indigent that they and their families will starve if they don't engage in this work. It includes transactional sex for rent. It includes transactional sex to sustain yourself during university. It includes the much described STM, sexually transmitted marks, in schools. So the notion of this harm was not this fallacy that I believe, and I think Stu suggests in the book, is this fallacy of something that's really immoral and really terrible and hurts the sex worker. But I think that the criminalization of this further entrenches the inability and the inhibition around flourishing. Does that mean I think that sex work is an appropriate and a forum or exercise of liberty? Yes, it does, where there is true choice. And I think that the criminalization of sex work is a criminalization not because it's based on a need to protect women and youngsters who are involved in sex work. And here I'm really taking off the table trafficking. I think it's a very separate discussion, right? And so taking that off the table. But this type of sex work is criminalized and continues to be criminalized in an egalitarian and libertarian state precisely because of one reason, and one reason only, and that's a moral fixation with sex. And this is going to be the theme throughout my analysis. The moral fixation with sex that the Constitutional Court and our political demos has is not about necessarily protecting individuals, but it is about ensuring that there is a continuation of a morality and a commitment to certain traditions and cultures that would that must be sustained irrespective of whether or not they miss the true harm caused by those structures. And this is, I think, very revealing in a case that was not discussed by Stu, fair enough, I'm not suggesting that's a critique, but the case of Falk v. Robinson, the domestic partnerships case. And in that case, the Constitutional Court held that domestic partnerships between same-sex couples is different from domestic partnerships between heterosexual couples, right? Because heterosexual couples, the court held, have a choice. They have a choice to engage in marriage and therefore choose not to. And never before has the magic hole been so brilliantly developed. Because there's this perception of choice that an individual who is subject either to the history of this country of migrant labor, that the economic imperatives that drive relationships today, the cost of lobola, the demand that is imposed on people irrespective of true meaningful choice, and the simple ideological desire amongst some people to live together free of the matrix of marriage. That was not recognized by the court. Choice, they said, is available. Liberty, they said, is available. And I would argue strongly that this is a mismatch, both of the reality that underpins domestic partnerships, but also a failure to allow them to flourish. And all we're asking really is that some kind of legislative and economic regime, property regime, applies to such relationships, not that any other imprimatur of the state be given. But this was not available. And who continues to be hurt are, unsurprisingly, the same category of people who continue to be hurt by the criminalization of sex work, namely young black South African women, for the most part, with exceptions, of course. How much time do I have left? Another an hour or so? Excellent. So,
remember, I have to respond to it.
Yeah, that's why I'm going to go on. So
All right, make my life better.
and then I'm actually not going to be that much longer. And then we get to the Bear case, which Stu does engage. And this is the primogenitor case, holding that women can, in fact, inherit. But here's the problem I have with the Bear case. The Bear's judgment speaks to this notion of custom and tradition that is cast very much as, to be frank, black custom and tradition. Right? And the constitutional framework is cast as that which is democratic or that which is constitutionally relevant. It's the ruling ideology. And I wonder if, to some extent, there hasn't been an imperialistic imposition of this constitutional framework over the rest of the multitude of cultures that comprise South Africa. Don't get me wrong, I like the Constitution and the constitutional framework. But here's what worries me. In the development of the Bear judgment, there was language that was readily happy to impose a constitutional imperative over a particular cultural imperative, where that cultural imperative was inconsistent with the Constitution. So you are absolutely entitled to do away with this principle of primogeniture as long as you could sustain it with a constitutional argument, right? But what about another normative traditional framework that hasn't been opposed by the Constitutional Court in any of its judgments? What about I don't think it's only white, but for ease of reference and simplicity, the patriarchal heteronormative framework that allows the selling of motor vehicles to be aligned with women's bodies, that allows pornography in the workplace to be shown in a manner that somehow does not compromise women's roles in the workplace, that allows women and men to be paid for the same work. So sitting at this table, let me tell you, there's between a 2 and 5% pay differential between all of us, based not on our status and not on our education in the academy in this country, right? Based only on sex, and to some degree, sex and race. So what about that custom and tradition? What about the tradition that says that for the most dangerous things a woman can do in her life in this country are, 1, have a baby, and 2, live with a man? Where are those traditions not opposed by this constitutional framework? And had that reality, had we taken the little red or blue pill that allowed us to see that reality, I would suggest there would have been a very different outcome in those cases, and one that I think hopefully may be fueled by Stu's arguments. And Stu compellingly talks about exit from the automatic. Right? He talks about this notion that you can vote with your feet, you can exit from the automatic, we don't have to be beguiled into thinking we have a predetermined life. But many of us still do. And that's not only about the culture or religion or identity we adopt, but it's also in the less defined traditions and obligations that are imposed on us. You will grow up and you will get married and you will have a family and you will be the one taking maternity leave and you will be the one who will earn a lower salary. And let me ask you this, what is the major difference between lobola, the paying of lobola, which receives some critique by various sources in Stu's book? What's the difference between that and the continued reality that men are bigger breadwinners than women? I'll tell you what the difference is: time. The one happens before the marriage, the other happens after the marriage. So in our very elitist objection to lobola, I think the culture that is aligned with this constitutional Western democracy also needs to take a hard, long, firm look at its own oppressive values. And I'd like to end by thinking a little bit about what a truly plural society would look like. This grand experiment that Stu proposes where we can all go our own ways. And one suggestion I have is that we understand pluralism not about the difference of identity, but that we understand pluralism about the difference in the way we experience harm. We have many plural cultures, yes, but we also have many plural dangers. We also have many different ways in which we experience harm. And it is that differential which, if not properly captured by the political structures and by the constitutional court and other courts, it is that differential which will impede our true flourishing. It is that differential of harm which will ensure that for as long as those cultural norms are not challenged, that differential of harm will ensure a clampdown on the Kantian freedom and on the Woolsian flourishing. Thanks very much.
I just turned it off. Okay, it's always, I guess, a bit of a challenge when you are on a panel where you speak, because I mean, who can top the Matrix?
You
no,
can.
I don't know about that. Okay, I guess first things first is to say thank you for being invited here to talk about what is a very, very big book. I mean, this is the sort of book that could actually be a doorstopper at a cathedral, and those are pretty big doors. But it's not only a big book in terms of size; it's a big book in terms of the ideas, and I think the ideas that Stu offers up are very, very important ideas that, as South African constitutional scholars, I think South African political theorists, sociologists, and so forth, need to actually engage with quite seriously. Now, the format of my comments or my contributions is going to be to engage with the text a little bit more. I'm going to actually let Woolman speak in his own words before he responds. So he's going to have two bites at the cherry, which I'm sure Stu is not going to mind doing. Now, as I engaged with the book, one of the questions that really kept me going was really trying to figure out what exactly is it that made Stu embark on this project. Anybody who's vaguely familiar with Stu's work will know that he's probably one of the most published authors in South African constitutional law, and he has sustained quite a far-reaching and deep set deep-seated project in constitutional law. So I tried to figure out what is it about. Is it A, the fact that he has identified some crisis? In the preface, he talks about some crisis that we need to respond to. And I asked myself, what crisis is he talking about? If we ask somebody in contemporary South Africa to name a crisis, people can reel off a lot of crisis. But I said to myself, is it about the moral, legal, ethical, social, cultural, and above all, political crisis that is our common heritage as South Africans? That's our bequest from apartheid and colonialism. And if this is the crisis that he's engaging with, exactly how does one constitutional law book hope to deal with this? Or is it a book in which he sets out to provide some set of theoretical prescriptions as to what we ought to be doing to make our constitution function optimally in order to achieve the lofty goals and lofty aims that the drafters of our constitution established? Or is it a book that seeks to probe, prod, suggest, and nudge our thinking towards framing a collective adjustment as to how we view ourselves in relation to the Constitution, and a book that tries to help us forge some level of a common vision, just like the Tiahua nations that are spoken of in the preface. If you don't read the entire book, you must read the preface and the first chapter. It gives you a very good sense of the ambitions of this book and the possibilities that Stews identifies in the Constitution. And then the final alternative was, is he also proposing a grand theory of constitutionalism that seeks to give us an alternative to what I now conceive of as a theory of constitutionalism that we teach in our law schools, that seems to regard the Constitution as largely infallible and whose underlying assumptions and logic we shouldn't question. We must just accept the Constitution and be grateful that we have this Constitution. And I think my own conclusions are that the aim of this book is really to do a little bit of everything above. But what it does quite interestingly is that it does this without gesturing towards a form of rapture or revolutionary political action to address this crisis that Woolman suggests to us. What Woolman says in his own words about the book is that he calls it a book of tips that presses his contemporaries and betters in the South African Legal Academy on the bench in practice to reassess our most basic assumptions about the self, the social, and the political, and the constitutional, to consider these conclusions and how we continue to engage with the practice of South African constitutional law. Now, all well and good. So far, if this room is full of law students, all well and good, we're all comfortable. If it's full of philosophers, we're all pretty comfortable. Except for the fact that Woolman decides to do this, to nudge us, to prod us, to do these things by taking us through an unbelievable number of disciplines and theories. And I'll give you a sense of the different areas that he covers in the book. There's neuroscience, cognitive psychology, consciousness studies, choice architecture, development theory, experimental philosophy, new governance jurisprudence, capabilities approach, and somewhere in there he throws in a little bit of constitutionalism, of constitutional law. But what he really does well is that he manages to do this in a way that is both accessible and actually ultimately quite enjoyable. And I'm not actually being paid to say this. So my initial reaction was to be a little bit concerned that I wouldn't be able to flow with everything. I'm scared of science. I'm scared of things that the things that I'm not familiar with. But Woolman does this in a way, as I said, that's quite accessible and quite enjoyable. So now let's get a little bit into what Woolman says and why I think this is a very important book for us as constitutional lawyers to engage with. Thad has already stolen a little bit of my thunder, so I'll try not to traverse the ground that he has traversed in exactly the same terms. But this is what I'd prepared, so I'll continue to flow with that. Now, one of the things that Woolman says about the book is that it's a modest attempt to contribute to South African constitutional law. The one thing that I'll say is that it's a very serious, theoretically rich yet empirically driven book, and modest is not one of the ways that I would describe it. It's critical, it's engaging, and it's quite serious. And why I bring this in is that one of the first things that he does is he tells us that we are wrong in the way that we understand freedom. He tells us, just give me a second. Yeah, basically his point about our being wrong in the way that we understand freedom is that it actually affects the way in which our constitutional law jurisprudence plays itself out. And this is an important point, I guess, for law students and I guess philosophers alike, because it does really, as you read the book and you get it and you get through the book, you start to see how this charge that we've gotten it wrong cashes out in the end. So what Woolman basically tells us is that, and I quote, "Our notion of selfness is a function of a complex array of semi-independent neural muscular networks that control the body's journey through life. This complex set of dispositional states is a function of both the deeper grammar of our brains and bodies and the social endowments that have evolved over time to determine various patterns of behavior. It should be apparent from this brief account that the self or the mind is a valuable abstraction and not an entity that stands back from the experience and then dictates to the body what it does in response to various stimuli." Very, very big words. But very simply, what Woolman is saying to us is that the self is conditioned by the way that we are made up neurologically or biologically. But most importantly, and this is what we need to think about in how we understand the self, is that the self is also made up of our experiences, our life context, our histories of which we are part. So according to Woolman, the self is just a center of narrative gravity, which means, in very simple terms, that we are very many stories, we are very many beings. We are students, we are brothers, we are fathers, we are sons, we're black, we're white, we are, you go on. So this idea that freedom plays itself out in a way where we are actually free-willed human beings who can choose what we want to do at any given point is actually a misconception or a misunderstanding of what we are as human beings. And as long as our jurisprudence, our constitutional law jurisprudence relies on this idea that Woolman tells us derives from classic, from liberalism, but primarily classic liberalism and what he terms folk psychology, and we see the individual as this atomistic being who can simply do as he or she pleases, we're going to lose the point, because freedom doesn't actually work like that. We are bounded beings. We are determined beings to a certain levels. We're heterogeneous beings, and our jurisprudence and the way that we think of ourselves needs to take this into account if we're ever going to achieve the end of being flourishing flourishing beings. And the reason that this is important is because it's through our experiences and through the way that we understand ourselves that we form some level of consciousness and try and figure out our way through life through various forms of experimentation. If I'm not an island by myself, and I'm a friend, and Bonnie is my friend, which she is, in the way that I conduct myself, at some point I will be influenced by my interactions with her as a friend, as a feminist, as a spouse, to somebody else.
Not actually married.
No, I didn't say my spouse. as a spouse, and in the way that I exercise my rights, I exercise my what I do as a constitutional citizen, I'll be influenced by many different things. And what this cashes out into is that it's a recognition of the fact that I am part of a society, and not only am I part of one society, I'm part of many different associations and different aspects of society which then influence who I am. And because of this, as a conscious being, I am then prone to experimenting, trying to receive feedback before I embark on certain types of conduct. So before I go and give a lecture on domestic violence, Bonnie's an expert on domestic violence, I might speak to Bonnie and then see ways in which I can couch it in a sensitive way. But ultimately, we're part of a broader society, and the self is a bounded self, is not this individuated, non-connected self. Now, what one can take out of that is that rather than this emphasis on this idea of just being free and us celebrating an abstract freedom, what we should be trying to move towards is flourishing. But flourishing means that the various aspects of me must have ways in which I can express myself, I can attain the full and I guess happy Sanele Sebanda. What Stu then does is that he then takes those ideas and maps them onto the social. And in mapping those ideas onto the social, Stu is again suggesting that the way that in which society works requires that we understand society in a way that freedom of ideas like freedom of association just don't simply mean that you can belong to a particular group and be happy with that, but they mean that we must have a society which allows for our various associations to interact and to overlap, and that again requires experimentation. Now, I think when it comes to the constitutional, Stu pursues a similar line, and I think from a constitutional scholar's point of view, there's really a lot to engage with there, and we need to think about how we interpret the Constitution in such a way that it encourages flourishing. And the idea of experimentation means that we need to be critical of the institutions and the structures that we have in place and how we conceive of our society changing to becoming this society of, or this regime of flourishing. Now, I'm not here simply to be a praise singer. And I certainly have some misgivings. The book has given me a lot to think about. Maybe misgivings might be a bit strong, but let's say I retain a certain level of skepticism with respect to the construction. I'm being told 0 minutes. With respect to the construction of the Selfless Constitution. And one of the things that I would like Stu to address or to think about, and we'll probably have a conversation about, is in how I find the book not adequately historically engaged, considering that it is dealing with South African constitutional law. What do I mean by not adequately historically engaged? I mean that there's a reliance particularly on United States constitutional scholars. And that's not in itself a problem. But in relying on United States constitutional scholars, then there's references to ideas of a shared vision within United States society. But my question would be, do those scholars, and does the iteration of experimental constitutionalism adequately take into account the racial problem in America and the structured patterns of exclusion that have maintained, that have been part of the unspoken aspects of the U.S. constitutionalism? If we then map that onto South Africa, and this is a direct critique of the book, how does experimental constitutionalism seek to deal with the fact that South Africa is really a post-colonial society where the underlying social and economic structures have set up the society in such a way that it's deeply divided along many lines, including racial lines. Now, moving from the historical, one of the other questions, or one of the elements that I would want to probe, is what exactly are the underlying economic and cultural assumptions of the self in a regime of flourishing? Yes, the self is made up of numerous selves. There's a gravity of the self. But it's also true that many of us in our societies are self-hating. They are uneducated or undereducated in a formal sense. They are marginalized, they're socially maligned, they suffer from inferiority complexes, and they generally harbor deep-seated senses of social, political, economic, and cultural exclusion, owing to a particular history that we have. So I would ask, does experimental constitutionalism hold the same possibilities for such persons that I've just described as it does for somebody with a superiority complex, with extensive formal education and great wealth? In short, what I'm saying is, can experimental constitutionalism offer us, or what does experimental constitutionalism offer us with respect to overturning the structural exclusions of deeply divided societies?
Thanks. Well, I'm going to reveal myself. I'm not Mr. Smith from The Matrix. I'm actually Neo. I am the one. I'm here to save you. Okay. I might need my glasses, so forgive me if I put them back on. Thad did an absolutely splendid job in 10 minutes of laying out the major lineaments within the text. Now, I can't do all of 650 pages in 10 minutes, but he gave it a fantastic shot. And I want to recognize that. And I want to say one thing, and it's interested me since Thad came out with his magnum opus just a couple of months ago, Meaning in Life, which is an extraordinary work, and if you haven't read it, you should. And what I want to say is this. I want to keep my engagement with Thad rather limited, not because there's not a lot to say, but because I think we're actually very close. I think I said this to him before, maybe in person and in email. Skip to page 238, as he tells you in a lot of his talks, if you want to know the answer. Well, when you skip to 238, you realize that, to a large extent, that Thad's vision of the good society and my own vision of the good society are not substantially far apart, if they're far apart at all. I mean, I happen to think golf might be a justifiable and good practice. Thad is holding out. He hasn't made a decision yet as to whether golf should be preferred over, let's say, listening to Vladimir Hurwitz play the violin. But okay, that's a minor difference. And I also want to say, the point I want to make with Thad is, in chapter 7 of my book, I do a little bit of flipping. I use dignity. I use Kant's, what I perceive, at least in South African constitutional law, to talk about 5 different notions, definitions of dignity. And what I then do is recast them in terms of flourishing. And what that allows me to do in chapter 7 is get rid of the metaphysical baggage of freedom that I think all of my fellow panelists might agree holds us back. So there's a huge amount of agreement between what Thad and I have to say. He happens to be a philosopher, come constitutional lawyer. I'm a constitutional scholar, come occasional philosopher. But I don't think there's actually all that much that separates us. Although you might want to prick Thad on that one. I'm sure he'd have a lot to say. So I wanted to keep it short with Thad because he got everything so right. With Bonnie, again, I think we're fundamentally on the same page. And I do mention Volks, by the way, except it's just buried in one of my extraordinarily long but readable footnotes. Very entertaining footnotes. But it's there. My concern with Jordan, which she wants to take off the table and I want to put back on, has to do with sexual trafficking. Because one way or the other, the majority, and I've worked on sexual trafficking, and I've worked on interpersonal violence. These, for most prostitutes in South Africa and in Southern Africa, they're not there because it's the best way to put food on the table. Oftentimes they're there, they've been sold there by their families. You might differ with me on the stats. These are the stats I was aware of. Families might lure their own female children once here from other countries and sell them into the slave trade. Once here, we're talking about getting out. The matrix is easy to get out of compared to sexual trafficking because you may be a woman who comes from elsewhere. You don't know the language. I'm starting to sound like Paul Simon. You don't know language. Don't have any currency. And you're surrounded by the sounds of people in the marketplace, and you don't know where you are. So the biggest likelihood for sexually trafficked women who somehow escape their condition is to wind up with the police, who often send them right back, not home, but back to where they were working. I don't want to spend too much time on that. Like I said, I do agree about the importance of interpersonal violence. I want to say that with cases like Bay, and then more so with Shilabana, that Shilabana is a case where you have multiple parties, and this also speaks to some of Sinelli's concerns. Multiple parties talking about what would it mean for the Baloyi people to have a woman as a Hosi, right? So no longer is a static and westernized notion of what customary law is. It's a dynamic, possibly, vision of what customary law might be. Even if we were to have as naturally and genetically determined, radically heterogeneous selves or individuals, the ability to participate in these communal discussions, we might want to opt out. And I didn't hear enough of that because I make a lot of that in my book. Not opt out simply by saying, hey, nice hanging out with you guys for 20 years, I'm out of here. But a sense that where you know you're a second-class citizen, right? And it's pounded home to you every day, and you pounded it home to us when you were talking about distinctions between male and female remuneration in the academy. Well, there's discrimination there. And if you're going to have the kind of egalitarian pluralist society that I imagine, then that's unfair discrimination. And the state and private bodies, if they are private bodies, universities kind of straddle that one, are obliged to give you the means to get out and imagine, and let's not underestimate people's imaginations, to possibly create different communities. It's not the norm. As my book goes to great lengths to say, most of the time we mimic what other people have done throughout history. We do it over and over again. If it's gay marriage, well, great, that might be new, but it's still marriage, and that's been around forever. As oppressive as it may be. I don't know, I'm not even going to go there with Bonnie. I'm only going to leave it. I'll talk to her afterwards. Holding back on my stand-up comedian voice. All right. So, and then I'm going to end up with Lobola. Of course, my view is that Lobola, continually reentrenches patriarchal dominance across numerous societies in South Africa. I would love to see somebody, I didn't do it myself, look at life opportunities for those people who had Lobola paid for them and those people who didn't have Lobola paid for them. If you could show that you had a better life outcome without Lobola, then I would say Lobola is clearly unconstitutional. Now, that doesn't go down well with a lot of my students in constitutional law and a lot of my students from traditional communities. A lot of women say, hey, wait a minute. You take away my Lobola, you're taking away my dignity. All right, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But if you want to ask me questions about it, you can. But I think, again, Bonnie and I are predominantly on the same page. I think the only thing I was primarily concerned more about was sexual trafficking, and maybe we can talk about that during question and answer. Oh, Sinelli. He got paid for this, by the way. You should know that. He did a fantastic job, and everything he said is right. But, of course, he leaves some things with a question mark, which means I have to provide an answer. So he says, where's this book coming from? What the hell is going on here? I'm 10 pages into it, and I can see a crisis. I can see, is this the best we can do? I can see nudging towards some form of collective adjustment. I can see that it's a book of tips, which is not Dworkinian in its aims, but rather modest with respect to the people with whom Stu works and the society to which I belong. I hate talking about myself in the third person. Only great athletes do that. I don't. I'm not that. Okay, so crisis. Well, actually, yeah. If I'm going to be honest about this, and I talked a little bit about it before the talk with Thad, and if I'm talking down and not looking at you guys, which is what usually I do, it's because is a complex body of thoughts that I'm trying to come to grips with as I talk. But crisis. Now, for those you may know a little bit about political philosophy, John Stuart Mill came to some of his great revelations after a crisis. What was his crisis? John Stuart Mill had a breakdown. But you didn't call it that back then. But that's what he did. He had a breakdown. And he also had a great wife who's not recognized on his texts. And out of that crisis came some insights into the human condition that I, perhaps 5 years, 10 years earlier, might not have thought so much about. I, being this rock star of a young academic, a hotshot, a little bit in love with myself, well, I might not have gone this way. So crisis is a good question to ask. I had my own crisis. Not John Stuart Mill's crisis, but my own crisis. And this book, to some extent, is largely born. And I hint at it, but I don't tell you what it is because it's not germane to the arguments of the book. They stand or fall on their own. Is this a best we can do kind of book? Well, that's kind of Mark Tushnet's criticism of experimental constitutionalism. You know, he's writing to Mike Dorff, Susan Sturm, Barry Friedman, William Simon, and company. He's saying, well, yeah, this is great, but it's the best you can do under a democratic capitalist society, right? That's all it is. Right? And that's not all. He says, no, actually, that's a pretty big deal. It's a social democratic account of what you can do under these circumstances. And you're going to nudge me further along, aren't you, Thad? 5 minutes, man. All right. I will talk rebase. Okay. So, yeah, in some sense it's the best we can do, but the next book, as I was going to say at the end, is called The Fragile Constitution. Right? So the next book is going to be what this Constitution can't do, hasn't done, and can't do. But you should know from our conversations that thing might have been coming along. So, okay, those are the 4 questions. It's not pace-off, but we asked 4 questions anyway. Okay, what else does Sinelli leave me with? Cogency. I mean, he talked about the subject matter covered. I think it's really important when we're academics not to talk down to people, but as Malcolm X said, to talk in a language that everyone here can perfectly understand. It's really important as an academic to be able to reach people. And the second thing an academic ought to be able to do is look around and see what's going on in other disciplines. And to the extent that your own thoughts seem to marry well with the thinking of what's happening elsewhere and in other disciplines, it makes your arguments, as William Rex says, somewhat more cogent, right? This bringing together of different strains of ideas. Is it modest in the way Tushnet would have it? No, it's not. It's designed to shake people up, right? And that's why the beginning starts in the way that Thad, Bonnie, and Sinelli has described. It's no stupid. This is not who you are. You're this. You're a lot of hardware. Now, you didn't create. You can thank your mom and dad for that. And you're a lot of software, which the various communities of which you are part have given to you. You're a lot of downloads. You're like HAL 9000 in 2001. A sentient being, but hardware and software, nevertheless. Okay, and my idea was not modest, but to shake people up. Now, I think I want to try to, and Thad has pointed me in the right direction. So I've said that this is the start, that the next book is coming. I can't tell you when. It doesn't have a 9-month gestation period, unfortunately. I mean, he's all right. Sinelli gets it. So, but both, I think what Bonnie would want to ask, and what Sinelli would want to ask, and what Thad's prodded me to ask is, oh, well, you borrowed this notion of experimental constitutionalism from a couple of friends of yours at Columbia. Does it speak to South African concerns? Well, buddy, I wrote this book for South Africa. If no one reads it in Germany, they got their own guys. This is a distinctly South African work. I didn't write it to be read in Iowa. It may speak to people in Iowa for all sorts of reasons that Thad has alluded to. But my primary concern, and half the book, is devoted to what goes on here. Now, if you look at the experimental constitutionalists, you'll look and see Susan Sturm and Pat Williams, who take part in this kind of dialogue. I hate the word dialogue. Address themselves to gender discrimination, to hierarchies based on gender in law schools, but throughout American society. So I don't draw as much on Sturm's work and Williams' work as I do on others, but it's there in experimental constitutionalism. Education, well, that's there too. It's there and it's here. And I know from my experiences working with Bram Fleisch, writing on education in South Africa, that there is something to be said for using this kind of template to kind of get the best feedback possible so that we can give learners the best possible primary and basic and secondary and tertiary education. Race. Is this book ahistorical? Well, yes and no. I draw on a lot of different people from a lot. It's not just U.S. common law guys. I spent a lot of time talking about Aristotle. Greek. It's all Greek to me. But there are a whole set of communities that I'm concerned with. Does this touch on race in South Africa? I would certainly hope so, even if I didn't directly address questions around the ontological structures of consciousness vis-a-vis race. But you can't read my book and read the cases that I prominently engage and not think, well, who are the actors here? The actors are predominantly black South Africans. Whether I'm talking about at length about education and housing, or whether I'm talking about the litigants in 20 of the Concord cases that I handpicked to try to show perhaps that the court is moving in the right direction. Is that the same as expressly having a chapter called Race and the Selfless Constitution? Perhaps not. If it's a limit on the book, then Sinelli will certainly correct course so that in my next book I don't have to answer the same question. And I think Thad wants to bring it to a close there. So I'll leave the question of race open. Sinelli might want to have something to say on that. I don't have the last word. I've barely had the first. But what I do want to say is thank you again to listening. I hope you'll read it. If you want it, I'll send it to you. Don't tell my publisher that. I give it away.